Let me start from the trends. Food and water supply imbalances. The key potential development here with regards to food and water supply imbalance is that this will worsen. And especially if we think, we look at the Mediterranean, we clearly see a trend, a long-term trend, a medium and long-term trend of food and supply imbalance. But if you also think of the policy of China in the past decade, it has been a policy to increasingly ensure the provision and supply of raw materials from all the different countries of the world that can provide soy or other key raw materials. And at the same time, China is, as we know, the main supplier of rare earth materials, given that they have 90% of this supply. And this imbalance is going to change. And this will have a very strong impact in how we need to organize our supply chains and how we need to plan our logistics investments. Second one is about raw material sources, so primary sources. There is also here a fairly clear trend about the fact that production shifts toward new raw materials will happen. So instead of increasing the recycling of secondary raw materials, we will see an increasing technology improvement which will shift from some raw materials to others, but the primary supply of raw materials will remain, maybe will shift geographically. Product life cycle. Here there is also a clear trend about products that are shortening their life cycle in all kinds of industries. This means, on one side, and specifically in some sectors, less business, for example, of parts, of spare parts, of replacement parts, and more a readjustment to the new products that are introduced in the market that, of course, many times also change the physical characteristics of the products and therefore the supply chain and the transport that comes with it. And then a fourth clear trend is about the level of environmental sustainability, where there is a clear idea that this will be a precondition for all the logistics companies to survive. More and more this is required by customers, by companies, that you comply with certain green standards, environmental standards, and therefore this is an area where you can't but invest. You can't help but invest. And going forward, this will no longer be a differentiating factor for logistics company. It will be a qualifier, as we say. So I think it's fairly clear about these trends. It's a more mixed situation, obviously, when we come to the switch points of uncertainty, and we can debate about them. Response to supply chain imbalance, which is strictly linked with the food and supply imbalance that we mentioned before. Whereas that is a clear trend, the food and water supply imbalance. With regards to response to the supply imbalance, there is some mild, moderate focus on the fact that there will be large-scale migrations. So rather than having the ability to solve the issues locally, there will be more and more migrations of populations. And this, of course, will have strong implications about the ability to guarantee this food and water supply also in overpopulated areas. Business clusters, I think this is another very important switch point of uncertainty. The debate here is whether we're going to see more and more specific industry clusters. Just imagine the Silicon Valley, but also, for example, the Italian specialized districts, versus whether there are going to be heterogeneous regional clusters where you see all kinds of different industries. And this is clearly the trend that we see in emerging countries. I don't like to use this term of emerging countries. I would call it the new superpowers. Not only China, but also India, Brazil, Indonesia, and all these kinds of large countries where we see more and more a localization and the regional development of all kinds of industries, which implies the need to localize your logistics infrastructure in these regions. As you know, if you think of China, the trend until not many years ago was to localize production in China for export towards other countries, so as a low-cost site. This is no longer the case. It is more and more, first of all, to serve the local market, and then from there to define a global export strategy for, an export strategy for the local region. Recycling cycles. So this is another very interesting and debatable switch point of uncertainty where the idea is whether recycling will be more and more localized or whether it will be more and more centralized because of the need of large economies of scale and the ability of having large sites that can process large volumes of materials that need to be recycled. This is really dependent on the kinds of materials that need to be recycled. If we think of materials like the plastics, like copper, like lead, this clearly requires large economies of scale, and so this is very much centralized in very few sites, and this is where there is more consensus for the experts. But this does not exclude also the need for local recycling for another kind of wastes. Just let's think of the residential waste, which is a big issue in Italy and in Europe by and large, and it will increasingly become a big issue also in emerging countries. And in fact, we see most European companies going abroad, going to the Middle East, for example, to set up local recycling facilities. Routing technology, this is another very important switch point really for the day-to-day operations planning. Is this going to be increasingly local routing facilitated, enabled by new technologies such as infomobility, or shall we continue to see a central routing ability and capability where basically you plan your logistics and you plan your transport centrally, and then you have limited capacity to intervene once the logistics is ongoing. The expert response is that this the routing will continue to be centralized, planned, and therefore even though we see an increasing trend towards infomobility, and we have a clear example here in Italy with the freight villages, with the infomobility platform for the freight villages, which is called WearNet, where basically you try to have a point-to-point communication between freight forwarders and intermodal freight villages to have a more flexible planning of logistics as you go. As a matter of fact, large logistics operators will continue to have a central planning of their logistics and of the routing. And another very important point is the traffic flows. Are we going to see more separation of flows, meaning specialized flows according whether we are planning for the last mile, for the long distance transportation, and depending on which kind of nodes we need to use for the handling of the materials, whether we're talking of ports, of intermodal ports, or airports, or are we going to see an integration of these flows through intermodality? Well, to my surprise, honestly, the response of the experts was more about the separation of flows. So I'm running out of time, so I will quickly go through, just touch on the switch points of opinion spread, and I will just enumerate them because as you see there are quite many. We're talking about interaction of interfaces. whether we will see more face-to-face interaction between customers and logistics companies, or more automation. More automation, that's the case, especially for the mass products. Driver for sustainability. Economic sustainability will be increasingly driven by regulations. This is pretty clear. IT standards were remaining with proprietary systems. Supply chains, more and more regionalized supply chains because of what we said before. Cost of fuel, this will become an extreme bottleneck. Last mile networks, there will be a bundling of local networks. And then I would touch on the division of tasks, which is very important. There will be more specialization either on specific industries, just for example automotive or chemicals, or on the supply chain, rather than integrated management of the logistics. Thank you very much. I tried to keep it condensed, and sorry if I went a bit over time. Just one last remark. What I said is part of our research book. So if you're interested, you can then send me an email, and this can be provided to you. Thank you.